There you go. Perfect. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to go through some very brief housekeeping items. So everyone will be muted. They are muted. And if you have a question or a comment, feel free to use the chat feature, and I will be moderating that throughout the presentation. We are recording this now, so it will be posted to our seminar website at the end, by the end of the week. If you are unable to stay for our full presentation, the recording will be up on our website. So while we're getting started, feel free to put your name and organization in the chat box, and we will go ahead and get started. So we are seeking your feedback on our seminars. We'd like to invite you to fill out a brief survey. After our seminar is finished today, we're really gathering feedback on the types of presentations that you all are interested in listening to and hearing, and any recommendations for future speakers for our seminar series. So I will be putting a link to a brief survey in the chat box throughout this seminar, and feel free to complete that after today's seminar is finished. And I'd also like to briefly introduce our seminar for next month before we get started today. So next month we have Dr. Ashwini Segal. He will be speaking about hemodialysis, which is a life-sustaining treatment that actually cleans the blood of patients with end-stage renal disease. And he'll be talking about the magnitude of this treatment's environmental impact in order to help identify potential solutions to reducing the carbon footprint of this procedure. So I will actually be putting the link to the event page for this seminar as well in the chat box. And if you're interested in attending next month on November 16th, go ahead and register. We hope to see you there. Okay, and without further ado, I will be letting Dr. Darcy Freeman, our center's director, introduce our two speakers for today.
Good morning, and thank you, Lindsay, for the nice welcome to everybody. And on behalf of our Sweatland Center, I would like to offer a special thank you. This is our annual national speaker focus seminar, and so I'm delighted to have two amazing speakers joining us today. Dr. Shanondora Billiot of the United Homa Nation is an assistant professor at Arizona State University. Dr. Billiot is an early career fellow of the Gulf Research Program through the National Academies of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering. She is currently serving as a technical advisory member of the Climate Change Task Force for the National Congress of American Indians, as well as an advisory board member for the Social Responses to a Changing Environment Grand Challenge led by the Academy of Social Workers. In addition, she is a member of the Governing Council for the Indigenous and Tribal Social Work Educators Association. Her current research uses mixed methods to explore Indigenous-specific sensitivities to global environmental change exposure and pathways to health outcomes within Indigenous populations, with the goal to co-develop adaptation strategies. As an Indigenous woman who has experienced repeated disasters and loss of home through environmental changes, she is committed to highlighting and addressing the social impacts of global environmental changes. She earned a PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis, as a Henry Rowe Cloud Fellow at Yale University and Minority Fellowship Program of the Council of Social Work Education. Her research uses mixed methods to explore, as I already mentioned, her research. Okay, our second speaker is Dr. Meredith C.F. Powers. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at UNC Greensboro. She has served as a university sustainability faculty fellow, is a social work faculty liaison for the International Program Center, and serves on the School of Health and Human Sciences Committee for internationalizing the curriculum. She has co-authored and co-edited a growing body of work on climate justice, climate migration, and the ecosocial worldview and ecotherapeutic practices for healing. She has presented her research nationally and internationally at professional conferences, including being invited as a keynote speaker at the United Nations for World Social Work Day. She is the founder and director of the International Federation of Social Workers Climate Justice Program. She also established and co-administers the Global Green Environmental Social Work Collaborative Network. Nationally, Dr. Powers serves as a member of the Grand Challenges for Social Work Committee, Create Social Responses to a Changing Environment. Locally, Dr. Powers is a founding board member of the Ideal League, which has the mission to provide equitable access to inclusive literacy materials and education activities that affirm, advocate for, and empower youth. Additionally, Dr. Powers has initiated and co-led several community engaged action research projects, such as Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Justice about climate migration and resettlement, Parks for All People, for the extensive enhancement of Smith Active Adult Outdoor Recreation Spaces, and most recently, a memorial garden project in Greensboro, the Service and Bravery Commemorative Garden, to honor military service members and veterans who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary. Dr. Powers was recently a keynote speaker on collaboration and current efforts for climate justice, and was honored with the inaugural Environmental Justice Champion Award at the 2021 Virtual Conference of Environmental Justice, hosted by the Institute for Social Work and Environmental Justice in partnership with Adelphi University. As you can see, we have an esteemed set of presenters today, and without further ado, I'd like to transfer it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And for the first part of this day, I guess we're working on the seminar specifically, and we'll reiterate a little bit of it for those of you joining for the training consultation after this. But the focus of today's topic is embracing an eco-social worldview. We'll kind of get into what that means. And we'll give you examples from community engaged teaching, practice, and research for environmental health equity. But before we get started, we want to start with a land acknowledgement. For me, I'm in North Carolina at UNC Greensboro. We are a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. And we acknowledge that the land we gather on has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically the Kiawe and Saura. And I would also like to acknowledge Indigenous and First Nation peoples worldwide whose land, winds, and waters we now all share. And I would like to pay respect to their beliefs and values and their continuing and enduring cultures which deepen and enrich the life of our global community.
Good morning, and I am located at Arizona State University, which we are located on the ancestral homelands of 22 tribal nations in Arizona who have inhabited this place for centuries, including the Acoma Ohotham or Pima and the Pipash Maricopa peoples. ASU seeks to embrace our place, connect with tribal communities, enable the success of each American Indian student. We reaffirm the university's commitment to these goals and acknowledge that everyone, the entire ASU community, is responsible for their achievement. I also acknowledge and pay respect to our Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Meredith, take it away.
Yeah, all right. So hopefully you're all coming to us with a little bit of background related to environmental issues, but we will kind of start with this idea of wicked problems. We might all be coming from different angles. I saw in the chat box, thanks for letting us know kind of who you are, where you're coming in from. I saw social workers, I saw people from chemistry, obviously from the Sweatland Center, folks from all over. So thanks for being with us. And we welcome you and your perspectives in this interdisciplinary space. So wicked problems is sort of this idea that problems exist in the world that are chronic and they're complex. They're often too complex that we would ever solve, but they're too important that we can't ignore them. We have to work on them. And pulling on one thread of a problem actually is connected to so many other threads. Some examples of these problems that are so interconnected and intertwined are colonialism, ableism, oppression and violence based on race, gender, and sexuality, the various structural inequalities, climate injustice, which we're talking about more in this presentation, and then the complexities that's been added with the global COVID-19 pandemic and the economic fallouts. These challenges also can create not only physical distress, but also our mental paralysis. Maybe we start feeling overwhelmed with anticipatory grief or the constant living through the ongoing grief and stressors. It also might be related to the ambiguous loss, that there's no end in sight and no way to fathom what all could actually be lost when all is said and done. A lot of these are related in the climate justice world, connected to eco grief and climate anxiety. And certainly we'll be talking about these different ideas throughout the presentations, but also we don't want to dwell on the problems. We just want to mention this, that they are wicked problems, but that we can all come at it from whatever angle, whatever positionality that you are in, and we all can come together and work on these solutions. Okay, next slide. So climate justice is one area that we are trying to kind of really get to the bottom of, start pulling on these threads. For me personally, I came at climate justice looking at my work with refugees and migrants. So the climate crisis, again, it's over and over being proven by scientists, especially with the recent IPCC report that just came out this year, that the climate crisis is indeed connected to human activities, and it's not just normal patterns of nature changing the climate. These are related to contamination, toxins, industrial pollution, and it relates to our species and habitat loss. Could be flooding, disastrous weather patterns such as typhoons, desertification. So the climate crisis impacts all of us, but it also impacts those who are already marginalized to an even greater degree, creating disparities. Much of that burden of the unsustainable consumption patterns, for instance, has fallen disproportionately on those vulnerable people in the world who typically have the smallest consumption patterns. So right there is a disparity and an injustice. In addition, those people who are already vulnerable, we see fewer of the benefits of connecting with nature and are also not able to recover from those disasters quite as well because they don't have the resources to begin with. So again, this is a global issue, but it's seen on a local level and certainly felt by those who are already oppressed and marginalized even further. Next slide, please. So environmental justice is within the broader scope of climate justice. And so I guess the way I describe climate justice is this massive sort of ecosystem justice. So humans just happen to be one species within the ecosystem. But we want climate justice for all so that there's the holistic well-being. Environmental justice is kind of specific to humans. So it's the environmental justice occurs when all people equally experience high levels of environmental protection. No group is excluded from the environmental policy and decision-making process, nor is impacted or affected by that disproportionate impact from those environmental hazards. So really what we're working towards is social justice that's related to environmental hazards or benefits from the environment. And that is really a human-centered viewpoint or terminology, if you will. So when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about a little bit broader umbrella that includes the whole ecosystem, all of the species, all of our kin and relatives that are not just human. And so environmental justice is one that's more specific, just related to how the impacts are on the human species. Next slide, please. So environmental racism is a huge piece of environmental justice. And again, that is that lack of benefit of the natural resources within our environment and the more of the burden of those hazards. And that's specifically caused by the oppression that's already in place with structural racism. An example of this in North Carolina, we have the town of Princeville, which was one of the first incorporated towns by freed Black slaves after the Civil War. And over the last 20 years, there have been hurricanes in North Carolina that has created flooding that has actually displaced over 2,000 people from Princeville. So again, this is also related to the fact that the land that they were incorporated in the first place was in a flood zone, and it wasn't ideal, pristine land that they were allowed to incorporate as freed slaves. So it was already set out as an environmental injustice situation, and environmental racism. Other examples might be other disasters or environmental degradation, and how people are going to be situated next to incinerators or toxic landfills or other situations that are certainly imposed upon communities that are based on racism. And again, related to those, again, wicked problems that are so connected, it is really hard that we have to understand that the ability for them to respond or be prepared for disasters, even when they're known to be coming, the economic impact is even harder. And again, often this leads to climate migration, such as in this photo. Next slide, please. So again, not to dwell too much on the problems, I promise we're getting to the happy stuff, the good stuff, the what are we going to do about this solutions. But one more slide to kind of say, well, what are the roots of these wicked problems? Why has it gotten so bad? From my own research, my own study, and coming from an anthropocentric worldview, from my own culture of origin as a non-Indigenous person, I started understanding in my Master's of Social Work program this thing called sustainability, and understanding how that connected to social work. And as social workers, we understood working with the person and environment, and that could also expand to be the physical environment, both the built and natural environment. And so I also was thinking, wait, humans are still in the center, and all of the nature is our resource, and we should be good stewards of it, but we were kind of outside or apart from nature. And then the more I grew and understood what worldviews are, and to see that there was something different, there was something that was more authentically congruent with sustainability. And I guess I started understanding something called an ecosocial lens, which we'll get to in a minute, an ecosocial worldview. But sticking with the problems right now. So this anthropocentric worldview, where humans are the center of the universe and everything is at our disposal to be used as a resource. We also have come into play with something called the growth ideology, that there's the possibility of infinite growth, and that anything that we can grow and develop should be done, and that enhances our well-being. And that's actually an insufficient measure of well-being. A lot of times people, countries use GDP as a well-being measure, and that's insufficient because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have happiness or quality of life or actual holistic well-being, where you, your family, your network, your kinship, even beyond the species of other humans, is being enhanced. So through this growth ideology, I've started to critique it and say, okay, there's something wrong with that. We do have limits to growth. We can't just keep growing exponentially and not have problems in our entire ecosystem, the health of our world. Obviously, again, climate change, the impacts that we're seeing. But somewhere along the line, sustainable development became sort of this catch, cure for everything. And it really isn't necessarily, because sustainable development is still situated within this growth ideology. Like, let's keep developing, but let's do it sustainably. But they're not really taking into account all of the different impacts. It's continuing to create false dichotomies between humans, which are part of nature, and creating a false dichotomy. It's continuing to perpetuate overconsumption, materialism, and the continued oppression and exploitation of people and the planet, the whole ecosystem. So these are some of the roots of the wicked problems. And now we'll move to shifting. What do we need to do about this? Next slide, please. So embracing an ecosocial lens is our worldview. This is sort of what I've come to understand in lots of my research and talking and dialoguing and learning from people like my colleague and friend, Dr. Billiot. And so this idea of an ecosocial lens is sort of a catch-all phrase for, again, someone who is not coming from a traditional people's or Indigenous people's perspective. I was thinking, well, what is this other thing that I didn't grow up with, that I didn't have, that's not anthropocentric, putting humans in the center of this diagram, right? And so it's making humans as part of that, you know, not outside of it or above it, but part of this ecosystem, the interconnectedness. Looking at sustainable use of resources and seeing that not just of resources, but the relationships are so key in this lens, the well-being of all, that we have this need to critically examine, like, why do we have certain social structures or values or beliefs and practices, and how are we actually reinforcing those if we don't start critiquing this? So the next slide, please. So one of the workbook series that I've been working on co-editing from social workers and community members from around the world have contributed. These are 2 chapters that I would encourage you to check out. And all of the workbook series are free to download. They're open access. And we have some information about that coming up. But 2 of the different chapters are really important, and I use them with all of my students and anybody who will listen. So the first one is chapter 1 of volume 2, and it's developing that critical self-awareness to incorporate sustainability worldviews. So it kind of says, you know, maybe you already came from a worldview that incorporated sustainability, that understood holism and holistic well-being. So, you know, it even has like a little exercise, and you can do a scale. And maybe it helps some people to realize that they even had a worldview. There's this idea of 2 fish swimming along in the water, and this other fish is swimming the other way and says, hey, how's the water today? And the fish look at him and say, oh, yeah, it's great. And then a little bit later, one fish looks at the other and says, wait a minute, what's water? You know, they were so immersed, so situated in it that they didn't even know that they were living in water. So again, your worldview may not be something that you're explicitly aware of. This is something that I had an epiphany, an aha moment, and I've started to investigate further. Other people may come at it from like, it's just their essence of being, and they don't necessarily bring it to the forefront of explicit conversations. So this is a great chapter to read and exercise. This other one is from Mariama Scott, who's an amazing hero of mine in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And she wrote this, and it just blew my mind. It's probably one of my favorite things I've ever read, understanding social work practice from the Indigenous Maori population. So I really encourage you to read that chapter. It's, again, these are exercises and chapters looking at social workers, but it is certainly open and hopefully applicable to others in many professions and different perspectives. So I encourage you to check those out. And now I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Billiot.
Thank you, Dr. Powers. I'm always so impressed and just amazed at listening to you. Dr. Powers is as one of the leading big picture thinkers and researchers and philosophers for ecosocial worldviews and social work, and just I just get lost sometimes in her words, and I forget that I'm actually having to do a job here. So in that forgetfulness, I apologize to the elders that might be on this particular Zoom or listening. I forgot to introduce myself in my language, so I'll do that now. Aluto se lu chafalai sayanta ilu uma seya berg ame tele. Hello, my name is Shanondora Billiot. I am from Louisiana, Houma citizen, and a town called Berg. So I'm going to be talking about one of the perspectives that Dr. Powers talked about, mentioned, which is the Indigenous worldview. But first, I wanted to give you sort of an understanding of what that means globally. So globally, 22% of the Earth's land surface is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples who live in 70 countries and constitute around 5,000 separate groupings. This means that approximately 6% of the world's population maintains about 80% of our world's biodiversity. And so when I talk about Indigenous peoples, I mean that peoples or nations who take their tribal identities as member of the human species from the landscapes and seascapes that gave them their unique tribal cultures. And although Indigenous peoples around the world contribute the least typically to changes in our environment, they are disproportionately affected by these changes due to at least three main reasons. First, Indigenous peoples are, just as mentioned, in close proximity to vulnerable ecosystems. Second, social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles are deeply reliant on our natural resources and for substance and cultural practices. For example, many Indigenous peoples' creation stories are rooted in the physical environment. And finally, due to historical events, Indigenous peoples as a group are disproportionately among the poorest of their societies and typically have the greatest health disparities. And while these changes are felt differently among Indigenous peoples, it is a consistent theme across the globe. And so, looking at an Indigenous perspective, these are just four of the R's that I utilize in my research, and that is the ability to recognize the relationships with myself, to tribal members as a citizen, but also as a scientist in some aspects, as a partner in some aspects, as a member of the human species in which I have to consciously be cognizant of any activities that I'm doing. Within research and working with tribal communities, I also try to, as much as possible, practice this idea of reciprocity. I do not intend to go into any community thinking that I'm going to just get this knowledge that they have, that is their sacred knowledge, and use it for my own career advancement or for any other exploitation purpose. As well as any activity that I do has to have a reciprocal benefit. So when I start a research project, the writing of the grant or the collecting of the data is really way down the line. The first aspects are building relationships and coming to a mutual agreement about what actual research we want to do, what data is collected that can benefit ultimately the tribe. And sometimes reciprocity is volunteering at a powwow or helping out where I can. And of course, that leads to just being respectful in all manners of following protocol of Indigenous communities. One simple aspect that some researchers, especially if you've grown up in a purely Western worldview, is the notion of eye contact. Many Indigenous peoples, my tribe in particular, believe that sustained eye contact is a sign of assertion or dominance. And so while you want to look at the person that you're speaking with, you don't want to stare them down or maintain this intense stare because they're interpreting it in a different way. And in that I have a responsibility not only to hold this to myself, these standards to myself, but also in any dissemination practices that happen, publications, presentations, but also, which is the hardest for me, calling out people who I'm working with and not participating in research projects where someone will not maintain that same level of respect that I know that Indigenous peoples deserve. And So here are some examples of chapters that are in 3 workbooks that Dr. Powers has co-edited with Dr. Michaela Winkle. And Meredith, would you like to talk about these chapters really quickly before we go back? Return to my aspect.
Yeah, sure. I saw somebody shared in the chat box the link, but yeah, it's on ifsw.org and you can download these workbook resources for free. And each chapter has sort of a little story, if you will, from a social worker or a community member. A lot of them are interdisciplinary, related to disaster or ecotherapy or you name it. And then a lot of them, we actually really tried to focus on Indigenous and First Nations peoples, centering Afro-centered approaches and eco-feminism. So I really hope that you'll check them out. Each of the volumes has different authors. Some came back to contribute more, and we were thrilled about that. But here on the side are a few examples of those different resources that you could find. So I won't go into great detail, but please download them each, as a PDF. You can download them for free. Just look at whatever chapter you prefer, or read the whole resource, and certainly use them with your students. They have little exercises at the end of each chapter too. So that might be another learning tool. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, I've used them in my classes from policy to community organizing. So they're great examples. All right, so next I'm going to be talking about how I developed a research agenda with my tribal community, and with the goal to develop adaptation activities for the the continual land loss that tribal members experience. And so just as a way of background, we are located in 6 parishes or counties on the Gulf Coast of the United States, and we are similar in size to the covers an area about the state of Delaware, which is also about the size of land that has been lost. So we've lost about half of our lands in the past century, sorry. All right, so beginning with the first phase, the tribal community and I agreed on some outcomes that the tribe wanted to understand. How do environmental changes impact health and mental health, but also how have these historical and modern or current colonial acts impact, how have they influence that relationship between our environment and our health. And so that was done with a mixed method survey that collected 160 surveys and 20 ethnographic or phenomenological, interviews with those citizens who were subsistence earners and or participated in commercial fishermen, those who lived close to and interacted with the land in the greatest fashion through their income and subsistence activities. And so what we found from there was that people who do have the greatest exposure, not just through observation and experiences, but that who are feeling threatened by their exposure to environmental changes are more likely to have both health and both health through physical, emotional, and mental illness outcomes. We also found that those who experienced discrimination were between 8 to 12 times more likely to meet criteria for mental health diagnosis of PTSD, anxiety, or depression. And so through this, we developed what was called returning to our roots intervention. It's really interesting with the language because the NIH calls it intervention, NSF might call it an adaptation, a community-based adaptation. And so our first, oh, I forgot to mention that our theoretical framework is published in these two articles, and I won't go into that because of time today. But our first returning to our roots pilot project was to identify cultural health beliefs to inform a culturally relevant and sustainable health promotion intervention among a group of Indigenous women. And this was through a 7-day outdoor experimental pilot with 20 Homa women ranging in age from 19 to 87. And we covered in the 7 days 126 miles, where participants walked an average of 4 miles per day, paddled canoes an average of 3 miles on 3 of those days. And so during the actual walk, we tested field operations, our curricular implementation feasibility, and the acceptability of the intervention to the participants. The intervention itself was it took 4 years. The curriculum took 4 years in development. And we conducted pre and post interviews, not just with the participants, but those community advisory members, tribal administrators, and just tribal citizens who were aware of the development along the way. And so what we found was that ceremony has needed, participants found ceremony was needed to heal trauma. We had ceremony in 3 spots, which were particularly harsh to ancestors along our forced migration route from where we were at contact to where we currently are on the Gulf Coast. And that through these ceremonies, these formalized ceremonies, not formal, but these more structured ceremonies where we were actually gathering in together to pray or do aspects of ceremony, but then also ceremony in the sense of walking with nature. Many of these areas are isolated and in woodsy areas or marshland areas, and participants found that this acted as a form of ceremony for them, and they were able to reconnect with their relationship to health, their own health, and their relationship to health of the environment. They also found that they were reconnecting with what they believe ancestors actually wanted for themselves and for future generations, and what they believe that they wanted for their future generations for health, and that it increased their desire to practice healthy behaviors. And then our post focus groups found that participants were actually increasing in healthy behaviors, and several reduced their body composition measurements. Sorry, I lost that word. And so through this program, participants found that there was space for being with Mother Earth, space for bonding with each other, and space for practicing culture. It increased their pride in their identity, and it increased their commitment to become good ancestors. One of the aspects in the post focus groups was that many of the elders that were in the original pilot requested that the pilot or that future iterations of this adaptation not be with necessarily older women, but with youth, and that it not just include females, but that it includes both or any gender. And so working with the tribal members as well as the participants, we came up with, and utilizing the theory of behavioral change, we came up with this multi-level a framework for developing this, or for implementing this intervention. It has not yet been funded, yet is the key word, through NIH, but it will be. I know this one day. So this is the research that we've done with HOMA. And so I will turn it now over to Dr. Powers, who will talk about some more individual level practices.
Yeah, thank you. I love listening. I took notes on your research. I can't wait to talk to you more about it. Yes, so one of the chapters that I put forth in the workbook series that I actually co-authored with a colleague here at UNC Greensboro, Dr. Justin Harmon, it's called The Mighty Powers of Mud. And so one of the ways that I kind of deal with wicked problems is getting out and getting muddy. I love the quote, the E.B. White quote that says, you know, I rise in the morning with this struggle, this dilemma of whether or not to save the world or savor the world. And it makes it very hard to plan the day. So sometimes when I'm not out saving the world and trying to do, you know, presentations and writing and teaching, I'm actually doing ecotherapy for my own savoring of the world and reconnecting and re-acknowledging my connections with nature. One way I love to do this is getting muddy by doing pottery or working with my daughter. These are her hands. We're planting some tomatoes in our garden that were seedlings from the local farmers market, organic seedlings. So Dr. Harmon also contributed to not just sort of, you know, the personal level, but working as a group. He works with folks, he's in community and therapeutic recreation, and he has a group called the Celebrate the Trail to Recovery, and does a lot with people who are recovering from cancer. And they go out and do trail walks, forest bathing as part of that research. And he's done a lot of qualitative interviews with people to see how that ecotherapeutic activity and connecting in nature and with each other builds forms of solidarity. So that chapter might be something that people are interested in for their own well-being, but also working with other client populations and community members. Thanks. Another project that I'm trying to get off the ground, or get in the ground, if you will, since it's a garden, but I kind of pitched the idea to some folks right before COVID came up. And so it's been a little slow going, but it's actually been probably good because it's built more community buy-in, more conversations, more brainstorming. But this idea of the SBC garden, the Service and Bravery Commemorative Garden, to honor military service members and veterans who are transgender, gender non-conforming and non-binary. So ideally, this would just be a reflective, contemplative garden space, not a community garden so much that it's about investing in growing vegetables and fruits for people to enjoy, although that might be part of what the garden is. But really, it's more for a place to celebrate, to create a space for memorials, for people to come together, to have recognition and visible, and something that's attractive, a visible memorial, not just like a monument, if you will. So that's something that I'm working on. I've actually got one donor who's really interested in partnering with us and has contributed some matching funds to get a scholarship for students at UNCG to work with this population and as their career goals. So hopefully this will bring more, yes. And then we have other examples, thank you, that I believe Darcy, Dr. Friedman, who shared with you a little bit in my bio. Some of the research that I've done locally is at a senior, an active adult center, Smith Active Adult Center. And this park here, it's in the top right corner. It's got a nice playground, a little gazebo in the background, and this beautiful newly renovated pickleball court complex. So when we first started kind of looking around Greensboro, seeing how could we get connected in our community to enhance spaces so that people could enjoy the outdoors, to, you know, re-acknowledge their connections with nature. And we started looking at populations that were a little bit marginalized, such as the seniors in our community, the active adults who were attending this senior center, which has recently changed its name to the Active Adult Center. They were just walking around in this little tiny gymnasium and no windows. And they had this beautiful outdoor space, but it was not well maintained. It actually had really awful dilapidated tennis courts. The gazebo and the seating area were not there. It did have the enhanced, newer playground feature. But we partnered with some funders from the Junior League Greensboro, and the city of Greensboro had already developed some plans. They just hadn't put them into action. So we all came together as a community, got volunteers involved, and created this really beautiful sort of space in between. The city enhanced the pickleball courts and created that outdoor space. And then we got the funding with the Junior League and the volunteership to create this beautiful spot to sit and sort of tie the two pickleball court and the playground together in this intergenerational space. So that was something that's really been fun to work on in the community. The one below is at Peace Haven Community Farm, which is just a little bit east of Greensboro and Witsit. And I started working with them on a research project using photo voice, which I actually learned from Dr. Friedman. Thank you. So that was one of my first community engaged research projects here as a faculty member at UNC Greensboro. And it has really truly become my happy place going out to the farm. I actually went out Sunday. They had their harvest festival and it was beautiful. Coming back together, again, still in COVID, using safety and risk measurements and caution. But this is an example of a photo from a few years ago when we actually had our photo voice project on display. And Peace Haven is a community farm that's inclusive for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's just an example of a community engaged research project that allowed people to become involved and speak for themselves using photo voice. And a lot of what the results were is that they wanted to sustain the sustainable farm, that it created space for ecotherapy, for holistic health and well-being, and creating community. That's just really been one of my favorite projects, and staying connected to that community, having some of their core members even be guest speakers with me at conferences and to come speak to my classes. It's been great. So yeah, and then this other one was not one I was part of, but some of my mentors were part of Challenge Adventures, and they ran wilderness therapy programs using the llamas and taking folks out onto the trails and understanding wilderness for ecotherapy. So I think that's about it. We'll speak a little bit more in depth about these research projects. If you want to get in touch with us, there's my contact information and Dr. Shanondora Billiot's information. And we have some additional resources. If you would like to connect with us, we have a listserv, Facebook group, Twitter. Certainly the IFSW Climate Justice Program has resources that go beyond social work as well. So we invite you to join in with us and have conversations. Thanks. Yeah, we can do that. Somebody's asking for contact information.
Yes, I was just going to say, I'm kind of going back through the chat now to see if there are any questions, since we do have about 10 minutes until the time here is over. So yes, could we get the contact information in the chat? That would be perfect. And then great. So I see that. And I just wanted to invite everybody who's on the call now. I did put this information in the chat at the beginning of the presentation, but Dr. Billiot and Dr. Powers will be hosting a training consultation session starting at 10:30. It is a separate Zoom link that you will be required to register for, but if you are interested in attending the 90-minute training consultation, please feel free to register using the link that is in the chat, and I will pop it in there again since it is kind of far back up there at the beginning, so it's easily accessible for everybody. But we invite you to register for that, and we hope to see you there. And I'm kind of going through just to make sure I didn't miss any questions, but go ahead, Darcy, in the meantime while I'm looking through this.
I just wanted to ask a question. First of all, thank you guys. It was excellent presentations and framing for how to think about the lens that we're using to think about health, and this much broader lens. So I'm curious, Dr. Billiot, I was actually, I really loved your adaptation. I like that framing better proposal, but I was curious, the systems like NIH are really in contrast, and in sometimes like actively in opposition to a lot of the Indigenous values that you mentioned. And so I was curious how do you integrate, you know, whatever, fitting into the round peg in the square hole kind of thing, and what's that conversation like with the community? You know, I mean, we have that a lot, you know, with a lot of the work that we're proposing to do, and it feels like the square peg doesn't fit in the round hole. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that navigation.
Thank you for that question. You're right. It is a behemoth, right? That they have like their goals that are quite in contrast. You know, the reality is that the tribal governments, especially HOMA, rely a lot on government grants. So they're probably more adept than many nonprofits that I've worked with in having you know, that dual language of, okay, this is the language that I need to use for this government agency, and how can we get what we need from this, from framing it in this way. And you know, I've learned so much about how to do that, you know, from the tribal administrator in particular. You know, she edits the grants. She like goes through the grant and she'll say, nope, this is too indigenous, you know, like this is too out there. Let's bring it back to NIH language. So it's because of her that it got as far as the director's level. I mean, it was denied at the director's level for NIMHD, but you know, it got that far because of her. So that's the reality, is that they have this ability to, much more so than me, to speak both languages.
I also did see another question in the chat. It was from Tim here at Sweatland Center. So he said, thank you for this great talk. This perspective is critical. The terms development and growth have been wrong for quite some time now, but too few people acknowledge this. What role does unrestrained capitalism play in this failure to shift our lens?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So I guess my most recent article with Dr. Michaela Winkle and Dr. Praveen Kumar, we speak specifically to this. We kind of look at, critique the sustainable development goals, because again, they are situated within this growth ideology coupled with neoliberalism and capitalism and infinite growth, or unrestrained capitalism, as you say. And so we're trying to have this conversation about how to decouple well-being and sustainability from this growth ideology. And really, you can't move away from the growth ideology unless you have a different worldview, honestly. So that's where it comes into play, where we have to just really shift to embrace an eco-social worldview, either one that you already come with from your own culture of origin, or one that you're starting to shift and embrace. But we need to center those that really promote authentic sustainability, and not this understanding of sustainable development that really is flawed and has a lot of conundrums. I mean, even the Sustainable Development Goals, as wonderful as it is to have people come together to have shared values and goals and aims and to have global conversations, it's very limited, and there's a lot of conundrums that, working towards achieving one goal actually depletes the achievement and success in another goal. So the article, I can share the link with you, but the article is really about how to navigate within and beyond the Sustainable Development Goals and embrace an eco-social worldview. So I can't remember if that was in this slide or in the other, but I'll find the link to that and share it with you.
Great, thank you so much for your response. So I think that's it. I do see a comment from Matt to Shanondora. If you're not in touch yet with Joni Admonson at ASU, I'd be happy to put you two in touch. She does crossover work between environmental justice, literature, and activism, and is active on many fronts at ASU. So yes, there's an email address here. We can connect you two in an email. That would be great. And yes, I don't see any other questions, but Dr. Billiot and Dr. Powers did put their email addresses in the chat, their contact information. And then just to confirm, this will be posted to our website, this recording. So you will be able to watch it again if you missed any part of it. It will be on our website by the end of this week.
And Lindsay, it looks like we actually did get one more question in the chat here. Does your work pull from regenerative systems framework as proposed by Bill Reed?
I don't know what those words are. So, I mean, I know the words, but I don't know what the concept is. So, so maybe Meredith, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that particularly. I know circular economy and those kind of frameworks that we do pull from, and certainly degrowth is another, it's a movement. It's not just a philosophy, but a movement. But it also has, some limitations. They themselves as a movement have understood that they're also coming from sort of a perspective that needs to be decolonized. So they've actually welcomed that at their latest international development, degrowth conference and having conversations. But yeah, I'll have to check into Bill Reed's work. It may be something I've come across, but it doesn't ring a bell at the moment. Thanks.
Great. Any other questions?
Dr. Dominelli asked can you explain what this framework is? I'm not sure which she's talking about.
Yes, if you want to clarify, that way we can get that question answered. And then Regan has also asked, I'm wondering how biomedical beliefs and perspective regarding health can coexist with Indigenous health systems. Do measures like BMI have a place in Indigenous eco-health interventions? Of course, Indigenous communities are not homogeneous and individuals are a composite of various cultural systems, but wondering what place a hegemonic system has biomedicine has. And then Dr. Phibbs also made a comment, BMI does not have a place in any proper measurement of health.
Absolutely true. I mean, that's the dichotomy, or that's the tension that Dr. Friedman talked about. That was BMI and the use of I can't remember what the system is, but the belts for physical exercise. That was, a request from the first iteration of our submission, and so we included it. That had no purpose for tribal members. There really were concerned more our tribal administrators for the intervention that I was talking about, adaptation. But we included it so that way it can pass the reviewer stage.
I just want to note I know we're at time, but these measurements and how they don't represent health and well-being and holistic well-being from the individual BMI level to the national GDP level, like we have to completely shift our frameworks and worldviews in order to get at the measurements for true health and well-being. Mm-hmm. So, thanks.
Okay, and I think Lena Dominelli did follow up and say that she was referring to the Bill Reed framework, and Meredith answered as far as she could. So that was the compliment.
Yeah, and I saw someone else shared a resource about
yes.
So that's great. We'll check that out. Thanks for sharing. I love learning from y'all as well. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. Thank you all for inviting us, and I look forward to any questions or emails that come my way.
Yeah, and definitely email me if you want to get involved in the Google group listserv. I'm sort of the volunteer administrator. I'll just add you, and I like to get to know people.
The creator.
Thanks.
Well, thank you both, and we'll be seeing you in the training consultation here in 30 minutes. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.